Now, of course, we've all heard what's going on at the minute in the Ukraine. And I admitted yesterday to you that as a broadcaster, I'm expected to know quite a lot about lots of things. Does that make sense? But in this occasion, I'll be honest with you, and I'll be completely transparent. I really don't know anything about it. And that could be my age. It could be the fact that I've never really known this sort of thing to happen before. So, of course, there may be people listening to this right now who are baby boomers or people a little bit older who know what was happening in the world wars. And then you've had other wars happening, or at least other invasions happening. But me, at the age I am, 37, I've never known conflict like this to happen, and I've never known there to be such a feeling of fear around the whole of the UK and the whole world. So rather than me try and battle my way through a script or read you out an article on the radio, we wanted to inform you and bring on people who know a lot more about this sort of thing than we do. So that's why we are blessed to have the Right Honourable Alistair Burt on the radio. Good morning, Alistair.
Morning, Gareth.
You've probably been very, very busy these last few days because everybody wants to know your take on what's going on, because I suppose you've got an insight governmentally with what may be happening. And you also know, because you're a UK citizen as well. And this is this is your field, isn't it, really? Just politics. And when things like this go on, you're the person that we turn to. So, Alistair, just explain to us, why is this happening? So why does it seem like the Ukraine is this innocent party which Russia have decided to invade? What's the reasoning behind it?
Okay, and thank you for asking. Yes, I chose as my vocation to be involved in public life and public life through politics. And I've been very lucky. It brought me time in Parliament, but also time as a Foreign Office Minister. So I do indeed have some inkling of how things are working at the moment. And I still travel. I was actually in Moscow just last week on something quite different. We might get to that later. But let me answer your question. At the end of the Second World War, Europe was effectively divided into two, between Russia and its satellite countries that it dominated, places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and what we call the West, everything from Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States. There was an ideological struggle between these two groups, which effectively ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. And the areas that had been controlled by the Soviet Union determined that they wanted to be free, and they elected different governments. Now, one of these areas was Ukraine, which chose the opportunity to be an independent sovereign country. Russia disputes this. President Putin believes that Ukraine is not a country at all. It is a part of Russia. And after some years, therefore, of independence and sovereignty, which means the ability to make your own decisions, President Putin has decided that he can no longer have a sovereign, independent Ukraine on his doorstep. And what you're seeing at the moment on the news is his attempt by force to change the government in Ukraine and either incorporate Ukraine back into Russia or to make it a client state subject to Russia. He is doing this with no international law on his side. He is doing it because he has decided this, and Russia, under his control, has decided this, and he's trying to exercise this decision by force. And it is being resisted by the people in Ukraine and its present government, who want to make their own decisions and want to be free of the control of Russia.
And what would somebody say who is, I guess, supporting the attacks on Ukraine? Because I've not heard it from the other side. So we hear about the Ukraine and what they're thinking about it, what the Americans and the UK are thinking about it. But if you are pro these attacks, if you're Russian, what would your viewpoint be? Why would you want this to happen?
Well, for a second, we'll take that view. But remember, there are people in Russia who do not agree with this. And we saw protesters on the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow last night. And it's very brave to protest in Russia. But taking the line that you suggest, we think President Putin's justification and thinking is like this. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 was followed by a period of great disruption in Russia. Russia was made very poor. People sold off its state assets. Russia was robbed by a number of its own citizens and others. It was very poor and impoverished, and it was a very dark time for Russia. Putin at that time worked with the KGB before the fall of the Berlin Wall and worked in security and took himself into local government, but he observed all this. And one of his motivations for strengthening Russia is not an unreasonable one. He does not want to see his country in that situation again. Sadly, however, he has come to the conclusion that instead of being a free nation, allowing the prosperity and development and growth that we take for granted, that brings us security, safety, and allows people to have the lives they want. He doesn't believe that. He believes that people are threatened if they have the opportunity to go their own way and potentially cause disruption. And he has gradually become more and more authoritarian in his own country, which is why the elections in Russia are not free and fair. It is why Alexei Navalny has been jailed and imprisoned for being an opposition leader. But also he has taken into his thinking that Russia is threatened by the NATO alliance. Many countries in the West belong to what we term a defensive alliance. This is a group of nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and others, who believe very strongly that collectively we are safer if we work together, and we say that if one of us is threatened, then we are all threatened, and we have a pact that says that. We believe we are not an aggressive force. President Putin does not agree with this. He thinks that NATO is a potentially threatening force to Russia. He has seen NATO be joined by states that used to be part of the Soviet Empire, like Poland and Latvia and Estonia and countries like that, not Ukraine. And he fears that Ukraine might have joined them, and therefore he would have a NATO country absolutely on his doorstep. And he has decided that that would be unsafe for Russia. He believes there are Russians living in Ukraine, as indeed there are, and therefore he has announced his plan to change the nature of Ukraine as we have seen. But he does so because he believes Russia will be safer this way, contrary to all the evidence that suggests that Russia is not under threat from NATO. Russia is not under threat from Ukraine, and there are Russians who do not agree with the line that he's taking. But if he was to defend it, I think that is what you would hear from him and members of his government.
Could there be a train of thought to say, well, Ukraine, they're not part of NATO. Now, NATO's, I guess, policy or their thinking is the fact that if you attack one, you attack us all. So we all protect the vulnerable country that's been attacked. Ukraine are not part of that. So some people may say, why are we getting involved? It's not our problem.
We're getting involved because ultimately we believe that the world works better and is more stable if people are allowed to have say in their government, and if government acts with the consent of its people. In that democracies do not get engaged in wars historically, because people much prefer to live a life without conflict. They want disputes and difficulties resolved in a different way. Authoritarian countries, countries where people do not choose their leadership, tend to be less stable, ironically, and are often the causes of conflict because they seek to exercise their control domestically, sometimes by having contest externally in order to rally their peoples. NATO works on the basis that people are free to make their decisions as to whether or not they join, but there is also some sensitivity. We understand, you can understand an opponent without agreeing with them. And I think some people do understand the concerns that Russia have and seek to persuade Russia that those concerns are unfounded. And every effort has been made to do that. There was and is no immediate prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. It is a decision for them. It's also a decision for NATO members. But there was no immediate prospect of this, and certainly no prospect of stationing anything in Ukraine that could be deemed as threatening or difficult for Russia. It is just that this process has now come to an end because President Putin has decided that he doesn't accept the assurances and wants to take a different course of action. But essentially, the West believes in the free association of nations making their own choice to belong to organizations or not, as in the case of the United Kingdom choosing whether or not it belongs to a political union such as the European Union. If people are free to make their decisions, free to make their own lives, then we believe this is the best way for people to live and indeed to be governed.
It's only when you look on a map you realise how big Russia actually is. We know
Oh,
it's
it
a big
is.
country, but then you see the size of it on a map and you're like, my goodness. So when you've got a country that big with such big resources, who have got chemical weapons, we know that. They've got large armies. They've got a force. They're a force to be reckoned with. And when you've got a country like that threatening, where do we go with this? So what do you think the world leaders will be thinking? I know that's a tricky question to ask you because you're not Boris Johnson and you're not Joe Biden. But from your experiences in government, what will be going on? And dare I ask, could this end up in a war?
Russia is very big, but it's not as strong as its size would suggest. Its economy is about the same size as that of Italy. Its economy does not compare in size with the United Kingdom or with America or with China. Russia is not economically amazingly strong, which means that any conflict it is involved in will cost it. It's got to pay its soldiers, it's got to build up its military, it spends a lot more on defense than we do, for example, but it's still got to pay them. It earns its money because it sells energy. Russia is an oil and gas rich country and it sells its energy. If people stop buying it, Russia will have less money. And what's happening at the moment in Russia is they are working out the impact of the financial sanctions that are going to be imposed upon it, because countries, instead of going to war these days, or at least countries in the West, try and change the course of events, not by physical force, but by using measures that will hurt a country and persuade it to take a different course, but not using weapons. And financial sanctions, preventing businesses from being able to work, preventing individuals sometimes from traveling, preventing individuals from storing money in different countries, from buying properties. And the United Kingdom has not had a good record with Russians over the years in relation to this. But what Russia will be calculating is whether it can afford these sanctions and how it's going to mitigate them. It will sell more of its energy probably to China and to others, but it will be stopped from selling things to other people. So Russia will be considering that. Leaders like Boris Johnson and Joe Biden will also be working out how much this will cost us, because Russia will not simply accept these sanctions. They will impose penalties on the UK and others. If less energy flows into Europe, it means the cost of energy is going to rise, because European continental nations that depend on Russia are going to have to buy their supplies from elsewhere. If there's less of a product and more people are buying it, the price goes up. So we are going to pay a price for what is happening in Ukraine and what Putin is doing. And the West will be working out how much this will cost, how long it will last, how they can best support Ukraine. They will have to make a consideration of whether they supply weapons to people in Ukraine, not British soldiers, but whether or not people who want to resist an enemy, somebody foreign coming into their street, are supplied with weapons in order to defend themselves, and what the long-term consequences of that will be. So all those sorts of calculations are going on. I would hope the biggest thing in all their minds would know that conflict is by far the worst option of all. People trying to defend their homeland in Ukraine are going to find it very difficult. They will be faced with a much larger army than them. There will be a lot of lives lost, completely needed to say, and civilians as well. It'll be quite dreadful. And everyone will be working out, how do we change this? How do we bring this to an end? And as you ended with, how do we stop it escalating? How do we make sure that nobody does anything stupid and that there is not a triggering of conflict between NATO nations and Russia, which would escalate the situation? I wonder if military commanders in Russia will also have a view on this and will not want to let their leadership take them into a situation of disaster. I think that is a factor too.
A few questions, and we have to go at 10 o'clock. But honestly, thank you so much, because we could talk to you for ages. It's so interesting to hear what's going on from a professional, and a real insight into all this. A message in from Joe, and Joe says, what is to stop Russia simply flying a plane over and dropping nuclear weapons on America or the UK and neighbouring countries?
What prevents that is the recognition that such an act would unleash countless episodes of damage on the perpetrator. We work in a way where countries know that if they were to seek to use a nuclear weapon against anyone, there would be immediate retaliation, massive loss of life, the destruction of effectively the modern world as we know it. We would be going back to the Stone Ages. No country could survive this, and no country seriously wants to take its people in this direction. No leadership would survive having inflicted this on a people. Also, be aware that intelligence knows an awful lot about what other people are doing. It would be people know if weapons are going to be launched or going to be used. And also people tend to know where other people are, and leaders who order such an attack would know that they would be targeted almost instantly. It would be a death sentence for everyone. So this sense that it would be just mutually disastrous holds back rational, logical, sane people and makes sure they don't do anything like that. Now, you could also argue, well, the same logic would hold anybody back from conflict. People get involved in conflict if they think they can win. President Putin believes that if he is successful in Ukraine, Russia will be stronger, and Ukraine will not be a threat, and he will have issued a warning to others. He believes that will buy stability and strength. Other people strongly disagree, and the crushing of individual freedom is something which we believe would only lead to more dissent and instability, let alone just being wrong for the people of Ukraine. But mostly it is a sense that we would all be in a disastrous situation if anyone unleashed weapons. There are very, very strict international laws about this, but when push comes to shove, sometimes those laws can be put to one side. But the threat of knowing that you're organizing your own destruction is perhaps the most potent.
And how do we pray into this situation, Alistair? What do we do? Do we pray for peace? Do we pray that, God's will be done? Where do we go with it? Because it's very difficult, isn't it, as Christians? Because we want peace. We believe that life is such a precious thing, but we also believe that we need to defend. So what do we do? How do we pray into it?
The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke yesterday, and again, there is a man leading the Church of Peace. But as you say, the Church and Christians have always recognized that evil has to be countered. We believe there's many different ways of doing it. An awful lot of diplomats, an awful lot of people involved in peace processes are Christians, and believe through their vocation, they're seeking to descale tensions and they're working for peace. But again, when someone comes to your door with a gun and threatens you and your family, there is a moment where you have to choose what to do. And effectively, that's where we believe that action should be taken. If you have reached a point where diplomacy has failed, or diplomacy cannot succeed because the aims of people are so divergent and different, then conflict erupts. I think Christians will pray that the situation that has led to conflict in Ukraine will come to an end, that there will continue to be efforts to convince Russia that its security and safety is not threatened, that if that is not the case, we will pray for the people of Ukraine, that they are safe, that they are supported and protected, and that their rights and freedoms remain well established. We will pray for those who will have to flee. There will be many refugees who flee from Ukraine who will need shelter and support, mostly in the countries around about them. They won't be coming to the United Kingdom. They will mostly be going to Poland and areas such as that. You need to pray for them and their safety. But ultimately, Pray for world leaders who have the responsibility to bring this to an end, and for people who have the power to see that what they're doing is wrong, to have the wisdom and discernment to recognize that. That, I think, is what we should seek to do at present. And remember that there are people in Russia who will not agree with what their government is doing. They will want peace too, and they will be put under a great deal of pressure. I don't believe ultimately that oppression wins, but sometimes it takes quite a long time on a human scale for oppression to be reversed.
Alistair, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and you take care, and we will continue to pray for this situation that's going on at the moment. And as we play this song, you know, maybe you're a person of faith, maybe you're not. It could be a time of reflection, could be a time of prayer. This is Leland with the Tears of the Saints. It's Connect Radio. And remember, just a few minutes of your time, there's a real power in prayer.